What's up, fellow curators? It's Brandon Patrick. Today on another episode of Curate, we are talking about 80s Prince. It is his most prolific and exciting era, and that's why I'm going to give you 3 records to add to your vinyl collection to properly represent the artistry of Prince in the 80s. And one of the records is a good chance you haven't heard of. Now, of course, we're starting this off with the most famous Prince album of all time, Purple Rain, the soundtrack to Purple Rain, the movie. That's right, this guy had a movie. This is his 6th album. He went to Warner Brothers and said, hey, if you guys can't put me in a movie, I'm walking. Went to his manager, told him the same thing. They got him a movie. And that's the result. One of the best-selling albums of all time. When people say, what Prince album should I get into? This is obviously where you gotta point them. It's the default, it's the standard, it's the one everyone knows. But what if you wanna get a little bit deeper? Now for me, this album, 1987's Sign of the Times, is Prince's greatest work. It's him mostly as a solo artist showing you the entire range of music he can create. It's got guitar spectacle, it's got funky stuff, live cut at the end, it's got a ballad, it's got this heartbreaking, melodic, angelic song, Adore, which is one of the most beautiful and amazing love songs of all time. This is far and away my personal favorite record, but that's not what this show is about. This show is about giving you 3 records that will get you familiar with the artist, and when you show your collection off to people, it's cohesive and it makes sense. So while I say you definitely have to get this album at some point, don't get it after Purple Rain, okay? If you're going for 80s Prince and you're trying to show the breadth and the depth of the artist, this is my second pick, Around the World in a Day. And it's a weird choice, but it shows so much of who Prince was. This is the album he put out after Purple Rain. So Purple Rain's 1984, this is 1985, and he hits you with Around the World in a Day. This album is peculiar because it's very rare that an artist at their peak looks at their output and says, hey, I'm gonna go in a totally different direction. There's no way I can top what I just did, so I'm gonna do something else, something that fulfills me artistically, but might not be as successful commercially. He knew that going in, and he came out with this, one of his most experimental and dynamic records to date. We don't know what's in the vault, but this is one of the ones that came out in the 80s. It's one of the records that people listen to and they're like, this is after Purple Rain? Sounds like a totally different band. And that's what it is. That's what it's about. He's showing you how many musical tricks he can pull from and still remain a dynamic and purposeful artist. So my second recommendation, not Sign of the Times, which is my personal favorite Prince album, but Around the World in a Day. And now for an album I almost guarantee you haven't heard of. For my third pick, this one's pretty hard to find. I had to get this copy shipped to me from overseas. Do you know what it is? I'm guessing you don't. It's called Madhouse 8. The band was Madhouse, the album was 8. Now, what is Madhouse? Was that Prince's band before the revolution? No. This is an album he did in 1986. This is one of the most Prince albums to ever exist in spirit. Madhouse is a fictional band. None of the members are real, with the exception of Eric Leeds, the saxophonist. Prince plays the guitar, the bass, the drums, the keyboards. Everything on this album that's not a saxophone comes from Prince. So it's 2 dudes making an experimental fusion jazz album. And it's quirky, weird, bizarre, but it's such a Prince move because no one was expecting, after the huge crescendo of Purple Rain, for Prince to come out with Around the World in a Day, which was already sonically very different. But then to follow that up secretly with an instrumental jazz album, no one saw that coming. And when it came on shelves from Paisley Park Records, they just assumed it was some artist associated with him. Maybe he did a little production. No. The entire thing is him. The writing, the creating, the structuring, the arranging, all of that was him, and he added Eric Leeds, the saxophone player, later. But when you hear things like Prince could play every instrument and play them well, there's not a ton of instances where each instrument gets to speak in a song. But with instrumental jazz, when there's no vocalist, these albums show you what that guy could do on piano, on drums, on keys, on bass, on guitar. He's just having fun, making music. You get to hear him as a drummer, how exciting and dynamic he could be as a drummer with a relatively light bass foot. You get to hear him as a guitar player with that funky, chunky rhythm sound, but he's also taking some interesting solos. His keyboard work is immaculate, and he fills the role of a jazz bassist as well as most jazz bassists. It's a surprising release, it's an interesting release, and it's one that if you can find and add to your collection, you're gonna impress a lot of people. It's a very hard to find record. Now, why not the Black Album? An equally obscure, difficult to find Prince record. In fact, the most bootlegged record of all time, because the Black Album officially came out under Warner Brothers in 1994, making it a 90s Prince album and not an 80s Prince album. Now, of course, if you're gonna get one Prince album, it's gotta be Purple Rain, especially when we're representing the 80s. This is the album to get. It's been reprinted a million times. This one's super shiny. It's like the reissue from 2000. It's the remaster from 2015, but the reissue from 2019. Ooh. It's a great album. You can get it on purple vinyl, you can get it on black vinyl, you can get it on 180 gram, 120 gram, 100 gram, 80 gram. You can get Purple Rain all the time. You can get it anywhere. It's ubiquitous. And it's also Prince's greatest work. My second choice has to be Around the World in a Day. It's sonically interesting, it's musically interesting, and as a follow-up to Purple Rain, listening to them back to back, it creates an interesting experience where you get to see two totally different sides of an artist. And of course, finish that off with 8 by Madhouse. There's another Madhouse album called 16. That one's a little bit different. It's got a couple of other musicians. You want 8. That's 80s Prince. Those are the 3 albums I recommend. Go out and get those. And if this episode was helpful, like, comment, subscribe. That helps me, and hopefully it helped you. Next week on the show, we're talking soul. We're talking singers. We're talking instrumental. It's going to be a soulful week, only on Curate. Thanks so much.